Just what is happening between the United States and Iran? Undoubtedly, tensions are high. The war of words continues to escalate, even though both sides insist they don't want war. On Monday, Iran announced it had increased its uranium enrichment capacity while still adhering to the nuclear deal that President Trump has pulled out of. It came as Trump tweeted that, quote, if Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran. After weeks of escalation and criticism from Congress, the White House is finally briefing lawmakers today. The Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif tells CNN in Tehran today that he is most worried about accidental war.
Iran is not interested in escalation. We have said very clearly that we will not be the party to begin escalation, but we will defend ourselves. Now, having all these military assets in a small waterway is in and of itself prone to accident, particularly when you have people who are interested in accidents. So extreme prudence is required, and we believe that the United States is playing a very, very dangerous game.
And in ramping up the rhetoric on Iran, President Trump's most hawkish aides have pointed to Iran's growing influence in the region, where it often pits itself against American interests. That is nothing new, as my next guest knows all too well. General David Petraeus led troops into Iraq during the 2003 war, and again during the 2007 surge. Later, he went on to lead the CIA, and he's now Global Institute Chair at KKR, a major New York investment firm. General Petraeus, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Christian.
So I think the first question that everybody wants to know is what I sort of alluded to. Is President Trump disposed to another military intervention or conflict in the Middle East? And you have said that you don't think so. Is that correct?
It is. I don't think so. I think he's been quite clear about that. Now, that doesn't mean that the threat to do something very significant were Iran to exceed a threshold beyond which the U.S. would have to take action. That is clearly there. But I don't sense that he is eager to get into this. I suspect there's been a lot of analysis of various options over the last few weeks. And everybody has been reminded that Iran is several times what Iraq was when we invaded in 2003. And it's 4 to 5 times, that's in population, and it's 4 to 5 times the landmass of Iraq as well. So I don't think any real serious thought is being given to an actual invasion. Certainly, I'm sure they're dusting off plans that I'm quite familiar with, having also been the U.S. Central Command commander for some kind of punitive strike against Iran. But I don't think anyone is eager to see that happen. I think the real question is, are the 12 demands that the Secretary of State of the United States issued last year, are they negotiable? I tend to think that that is the case. And I tend to think that Iran is going to start exploring opportunities, if not this year, then certainly next year, as the currency falls further. It's already plummeted, as the economy continues to decline quite precipitously, and as inflation increases, as the U.S. is taking waiver after waiver away from Iran when it comes to the export of their major commodity, which is, of course, oil.
So let me play this soundbite. We've already heard from Foreign Minister Zarif, who's talked about a very dangerous game of special interests in the United States seeking to provoke Iran, and that he's afraid of an accidental war. I'm going to get into that with you a little bit. But first, in regard to what you just said, that you think perhaps soon enough Iran will want to come back to the table, this is what he said about that.
We are not willing to talk to people who have broken their promises, because we talk to people. We did not believe that our nuclear program, our nuclear energy program, required us to provide any concessions or provide any confidence-building measures. But we engaged, we acted in good faith, we negotiated, we reached a deal. What the United States is saying is that we make a deal, whatever we can get you in the negotiations through the deal is fine. Whatever we cannot get you, we'll come back to try to get you. This is not the way serious countries deal with each other.
I mean, he has a point, right?
For serious countries don't engage in militia activity in countries around them. They don't try to Lebanonize Iraq and Syria and perhaps Yemen the way that they Lebanonized Lebanon. In other words, build a very powerful paramilitary and then get it substantial votes in the parliament as well. So again, certainly, and I am very clear that Iran did not violate the nuclear agreement, which the U.S. is a party to, a multilateral agreement. I'm not sure I would have recommended leaving it. But I certainly have shared the concern of this administration, which is a bipartisan concern, about the so-called malign Iranian activity, the effort to establish a Shia crescent, if you will, stretching from Iran through Iraq, through Syria, and down into southern Lebanon and Lebanese Hezbollah, and also the very threatening missile program testing that they've been carried out as well, which threatens our partners in the region and obviously our ally Israel also.
So tell me then, you've obviously been paying close attention, given your interests and your experience in the region. You've seen this escalation, and people have described it, foreign policy analysts, as one of the fastest escalation in terms of war of words, the rhetoric, the moving of the USS Lincoln, the carrier group, all of those things, anti-missile, Patriot batteries, etc. It is pretty intense. And then also you see the rhetoric dialing back from the United States side, then dialing forward again with just recently President Trump. The latest thing he said after saying he didn't want a war, he said, well, if Iran does something, it'll be the end of Iran. Just what strategy, what tactics are at play here?
Well, I'm sure that there's some discussion about them ongoing still. Again, there undoubtedly was a discussion of those who perhaps want to see something as enormous as regime change versus those that want to see regime behavior change, which is probably the more realistic possibility, given how extraordinary regime change would be. And also, frankly, the fact that we've learned that not all regime changes end up with the hopeful outcome for which we might wish. But, President Trump has a history of this all the way back to when he was a businessman. If you read The Art of the Deal, he says that before you even sit down with someone across the table with whom you'll negotiate, you punch the other guy in the nose. And he's doing that rhetorically. He did that with North Korea. He's done that with some of our partners with whom we have now achieved agreements. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement was preceded by quite tough rhetoric as well. The buildup of forces is actually not even a restoration to a moderate amount of what we used to have in that region. When I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, we had 250,000 U.S. men and women in uniform. This is much, much less than that. And the fact that we haven't had a carrier full-time was quite a significant withdrawal some year or two ago. Again, these are prudent measures, I think. They put us in a position, if we have to carry out something, that we have better defenses, as you mentioned, the Patriot ballistic missile defense batteries, and then also some additional bombers if it comes to that. But again, I don't think anyone is intent on a true war. My worry is that you have some trigger-happy rogue element, either in the Revolutionary Guards Corps, Navy, or perhaps an Iranian-supported Shia militia element in Iraq that triggers something from which there is an escalation. And let me just note, by the way, I absolutely stand with Dr. Barham Saleh, the president of Iraq, in hoping fervently that Iraq is not the soil on which some kind of either proxy or actual conflict between the U.S. and Iran takes place. The land of the two rivers is in a good position, and it needs to be allowed to rebuild itself, to restore basic services and the rest in the wake of the defeat of ISIS.
So how would you describe Iran's reaction so far in the year? Because all of this has come to a head precisely a year after President Trump pulled the United States out of this international UN-sanctioned nuclear deal. It's not just a piece of paper between the U.S.
Yep.
So Iran has said that it has reacted with, quote, maximum restraint to the U.S. official policy of maximum pressure. So do you buy that? I mean, do you agree that it has not provoked? And how do you read the so-called American intelligence that has led to this? What is the intelligence? What is the story of the missiles on the boats that we were told existed?
Well, first, let me just say that I think you can characterize what Iran has done also as a maximum hope. What they have tried to do by staying within the limits of the nuclear agreement, even though the U.S. departed it and reimposed sanctions, what they tried to do is keep Europe on board and to give Europe a chance to develop some kind of economic workaround to enable investment to continue and goods to be exported to Europe from Iran. And frankly, predictably, really, Europe has found this very difficult to do. Again, the dollar is the currency in which most trading takes place. Companies in Europe essentially have a choice. They can either do business with Iran or with the number one economy in the world, the United States. And I think the hopes that Iran and perhaps even some in Europe had for establishing some kind of trading mechanism have not borne out. The intelligence, I think, probably, again, solid intelligence in terms of developing indicators or hearing indicators, if you will, of warning orders. In other words, just for example, perhaps the Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani telling the Shia militia commanders in Iraq to be ready in case something is needed. The missiles on the boats, a little bit inconclusive because reportedly they've been taken off the boats. The one rocket attack in Baghdad, again, uncertain where that came from, reportedly from Kataib Hezbollah, an Iranian-supported Shia militia, but not conclusive. And then the attacks against the 4 ships that were off the port of Fujairah, that's actually outside the Strait of Hormuz, of course, in the Gulf of Oman. Again, not clear yet, presumably Iranian, and that is what U.S. sources apparently have been authorized to share off the record. But again, not that conclusive yet. And I think, frankly, what the president is trying to do is to say, hey, watch it. There is a threshold, and if you cross that threshold, we're not going to specify where. We've learned, I think, about red lines. But if there is a threshold that is crossed, then you could be in jeopardy of a very significant attack in return. Well, Iran does need to be very careful about that. Again, keep in mind, their economy is really plummeting. They're going to tighten their belt. They're certainly not going to come to the table anytime soon. But I suspect perhaps next year at some point in time, maybe interlocutors from Oman, who were very helpful for the United States and Iran during the early days of the nuclear agreement formulation, perhaps Switzerland, leader of which was just in the White House the other day, some third party that can enable some kind of discussion. And then the rhetoric is dialed down, as we have seen again in other cases where the president has sought to get an agreement.
So I was going to ask you about that because you mentioned North Korea. You mentioned the sort of, colorful rhetoric. You said, the president's style is to punch somebody in the face before actually coming to a negotiation and sitting around the table. He tried that obviously with North Korea, and there was a massive war of words, and there was a great fear globally that somehow it was going to go off the rails until it transpired into, honestly, these are the presidents were kind of a love fest between him and Kim Jong-un, but that in turn has not led to denuclearization and has led to, in fact, even more tension right now, to the point that the U.S. has seized a North Korean cargo ship earlier this month, and today the DPRK ambassador in the UN said the U.S., quote, should deliberate and think over the consequences of its outrageous acts, which might have on future developments. How is this going for President Trump, though, this strategy?
Well, I am not endorsing this. I'm not supporting or suggesting that this is how diplomacy should proceed or the kind of messaging that has been employed. I'm just describing a tactic, if you will, that has been employed by President Trump on numerous other occasions. Now, in some cases, it has actually achieved results. I think once the negotiators buckled down, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement was resolved after some very harsh rhetoric, as you will recall, both during the campaign about Mexico and then after the president took office. Some other cases where perhaps this may have worked a little bit as well, but some, as you note, North Korea most significantly, where that does not have appeared to yield the kind of success that has been sought. Again, we will have to see as this unfolds how long Iran can keep tightening its belt before the people are back on the streets again, as they were spontaneously last fall in many, many cities in Iran, as you know, expressing their displeasure with the situation in Iran at that time. And that was before the most recent drop in GDP growth, the most recent drop in the currency, and also the most recent rise in inflation. So it's going to get much tougher. And the question is, can there be something negotiated? Is Iran actually willing to discuss at all the so-called, and it is malign activity. Let's keep in mind, by the way, that we lost over 600 soldiers in Iraq to improvised explosive devices and these explosively formed penetrators that were made in Iran and then given to the Shia militia that Iran supported and used against our forces and our Iraqi partners.
You talk about obvious pressures that the Iranians are under because of the sanctions. They would say they've been under these pressures before. And certainly there is a lot of wishful thinking, particularly in the United States, about internal regime change by the people. And I just want to play you something that the president's national security advisor, John Bolton, said about that, but way before he became national security advisor.
For the first time in at least 8 years that I've been coming to this event, I can say that we have a president of the United States who is completely and totally opposed to the regime in Tehran. The behavior and the objectives of the regime are not going to change, and therefore the only solution is to change the regime itself. And that's why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran.
Well, that might have been overstated because it is 2019. The 40th anniversary of the revolution has happened, and Bolton is not celebrating in Tehran. Not to mention that he's speaking before a group known as the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, which has renamed itself, which most people believe is a sort of a very hardline Islamic group. But do you think that Bolton still has that dream of regime change, and might he be able to persuade enough people in the Trump administration? I mean, you've seen this movie before. It happened, in Iraq.
I don't see any similarity to the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and this. To be sure, John Bolton may still dream of that. There may be a few others who might have similar dreams. But the president has been very clear that he doesn't want war, and that would take an enormous invasion. The numbers are staggering what that would require. And a vastly more capable force with a very advanced Soviet air defense system in particular. Could we do it? Certainly we could do it. But there's a lot of other priorities around the world. And again, this is about what Iran is doing in the region and its threatening missile programs. And the question is, are they willing to negotiate about that? Or does it actually come to the point that you have some kind of punitive action, but certainly something well short of an invasion or a real intervention in Iran? And by the way, you said that Iran has shown a willingness to do this in the past, to tighten its belt. And that is true. But that was much closer to the revolutionary days. That was almost a holy war, literally, between Iraq and Iran. And the fervor at that time sustained the people. I'm not sure the citizenry of Iran at this point in time would be anywhere near as supportive if they continue down this road without some kind of sanction relief at some point next year at the least. Of course, they could just keep tightening the belt, maybe even putting a new hole or two in the belt to enable that, and wait until November 2020 and see if they get someone in the White House in January 2021 who is more moderate on Iran, but there's no guarantees of that. And they've got a long, long year and a half prior to that.
That's right. And it really is hurting ordinary people. There's no doubt about it. Could I please ask you a completely different question, but put your former commander hat on? President Trump is discussing the possibility of pardoning certain members of the U.S. military who've been accused of war crimes. You've probably heard the name of Operations Chief Edward Gallagher. He's a Navy SEAL, and he's been charged with premeditated murder, attempted murder, and a dozen other offenses, including obstruction of justice and bringing discredit on the armed forces. I mean, awfully, he allegedly shot indiscriminately at civilians, killed a teenage ISIS fighter with a custom blade, I mean, it's really awful, the accusations about him, how he potentially posed with a bloody corpse. He denies all the charges. But should President Trump be considering pardons of these kinds of alleged offenses that are underway right now?
Well, let me just start out by saying that, as you will recall, in fact, I think you were in Mosul with us at some point in time early on. And I remember as we were trying to determine how are we going to treat detainees, because this is not something that 101st Airborne Division had made great preparation for. And all of a sudden, we've got a lot of people that surrendered or were captured. And we decided, look, at the end of the day, let's just remember the law of land warfare, the Geneva Convention. And let me tell you that wherever we have violated the Geneva Convention, we have paid for it over time. Whether it was Abu Ghraib, whether it was enhanced interrogation techniques, which I've been against all along. I understand why they were employed when they were, and I went through that, obviously, when I took over the CIA. But again, if you violate these norms, inevitably, you pay a much greater price for that than whatever it is you get from those particular actions. And I would put that in this category. Again, that kind of discipline to adhere to the law of land warfare is very, very important. We have made it a point not to sink to the level of our adversaries, not to engage in barbaric activity. And that has been a very, very important North Star for us as we have carried out what are very frustrating campaigns against enemies who are often quite barbaric, who literally will blow themselves up to take us with them in some cases on the battlefield. So again, I would keep coming back to that, certainly, and using that as our guidepost as we go forward, and realize that any deviation from that, or again, pardon of action that clearly violated this, or the Uniform Code of Military Justice, could have some kind of significant downside when it comes to the discipline in this force that is so extraordinary.
Right.
Individuals who have raised their hand and taken an oath during a time of war, and who I believe want to, again, adhere to these kinds of norms because it is hugely important to us.
Okay, General Petraeus, thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Great to be with you again, Christian.
Thank you.